Are you sure?
Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never ask a bride why she's getting married. Don't wear a skirt on a windy day. Deodorant is not a shower. Don't sniff chili flakes. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The Chinese sort of let it be known to the world that they were finally going to put into effect their plan. You might call it a fantasy, but the Chinese do such things. Their plan of damming the Brahmaputra on their side of the watershed, on their side of the Himalayas, where it's called Yarlung Tsangpo. Now, Yarlung Tsangpo is a powerful river. The important thing is that it goes through what is called as the Great Bend or the Great U-turn or the Yarlung Tsangpo Great Bend. That bend, we'll explain the geography to you because the geography is awe-inspiring. That bend provides what might be the most perfect terrain and the most perfect geographical conditions for making a power generating dam, because power is generated in a hydroelectric project when water falls from an altitude. So the higher the gradient, the more power you can produce, the more energy that water can produce, because gravity gives it more energy. What the Chinese are now trying to do is to dam Brahmaputra at that bend. I will tell you how, at least broadly, and generate how much power? Generate 60 gigawatts of power. 60 gigawatts of power is like 60,000 megawatts of power. It's a lot of power, a lot of hydroelectric power. And they say this is very important for them if they have to achieve their own targets of net zero promises by 2030, if not 2030, then by 2033, by which time they say this dam will be ready. Now, the fact is that the Chinese already have too many big dams. The Chinese at this point have 87,000 dams of some considerable size across their country. China's rivers are the most dammed in the world. So nobody is quite convinced that the Chinese need this power, this additional power right now, also given the challenges of engineering in this case. But the Chinese faith in their engineering is I won't even say borders on arrogance. It is hugely arrogant because they think they can dam anything. They think they can link anything. They link big rivers. They can construct anything. Everything has to be the biggest, the largest, the deepest, the widest, etc., and the fastest. Most important, look at their trains right now. So the Chinese have great faith in their engineering and they think they can do it. Now that has immediately caused concern in India, great concern in India for multiple reasons. One, what does it do to our water security? Because China is the upper riparian. Upper riparian is the country which is the first to receive the water of a river or which is ahead of others who might receive that water next to it. So India is a lower riparian to China in this case, and similarly Bangladesh is an even lower riparian to India. And that is something that we see coming up all the time with Nile River. This is always an issue with multinational rivers. So Nile River, funnily or ironically, it is the country at the end of the river, Egypt, that exploited the waters most of all. And Egypt had the privilege of doing it in comfort because the poorer and the more backward African countries from where the river actually emerges, including Sudan, for example, they didn't quite have the wherewithal to make use of the water that was flowing out of there. And now it is leading to some conflicts in the Nile Delta and the entire Nile region as well. That said, I only used it as an example because there is an upper riparian and then next riparian and next riparian. This also plays out on our western and northern borders because we are the upper riparian with Himalayan rivers coming in and flowing into Pakistan, and there India and Pakistan, we and the Pakistanis, we are bound by Indus Valley Treaty. The Indus Valley Treaty then says that three of these Himalayan rivers, that is Indus, Jhelum and Chenab, Pakistan has the full right to those rivers. We can use those for run-of-the-river power production, and that's a complex thing. I will come to that. Also, we can retain some water as provided for in the treaty for local irrigation and also for drinking water needs. The other rivers, that is Ravi, Byas and Satluj, are fully ours. We can use all of that water. We are the upper riparian to Pakistan and we can use all of that water, and it's up to us how much water we want to let go into Pakistan. There is no obligation. However, remember, for some of those also, the upper riparian, or if I may say, the uppermost riparian is still China, because Satluj and Indus come from Tibet. Now, Tibet is the greatest source of river water in the entire world. Big rivers in the entire world. Some of the biggest rivers emerge from the Tibetan plateau. I will list these for you. These rivers are all multinational rivers. So Brahmaputra, as we know, China, India, Bangladesh, then Indus, China, India, Pakistan, Satluj, China, India, Pakistan, Karnali River, China, Nepal, India, New River, China, Myanmar, Thailand, Mekong River, China, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam. Yangtze River is the only one that's not multinational. It's a Chinese river. It comes out of Tibet though. Now understand the Brahmaputra. It's called Yarlung Tsangpo. In China, it does not run a short length in China, and see how it runs. It's not running north to south. It's actually running west to east. It emerges at the foot of the Mansarovar massif, right behind, some 50-60 kilometers southeast of Mansarovar massif. It emerges from there at about 17,400 feet. So it's also the highest river in the world. It's the highest river in the world. In places, it's also the deepest. Definitely, it creates the deepest gorge, or the deepest and the longest canyon in the world, which is where the bone of contention lies. But I will come to that as we journey along this long route. So about 1,700 kilometers of its total approximately 3,000 kilometer length, about 1,700 kilometers. This is rounded off broadly. This is not to the last decimal point. That runs in China west to the east. So from the foot of the Mansarovar, it runs east. So imagine how large that expanse is. If all of India's border with China is about 3,400 kilometers or so, along 1,700 kilometers, along half of it, the Brahmaputra River runs in China, on the Chinese side. That is the other side of the Himalayas, or the other side of the massif, you might say, or the other side of the watershed. So this river runs. Important thing is, this river has a very steep gradient. It has a very steep gradient even while it's running through Tibet. And then it comes into India. So about 950 thereabouts, because river keeps changing its course, and where it enters Bangladesh, if you go to Dhubri and see how it enters Bangladesh, you can see its shape, size changes all the time. It's a nightmare for anybody to figure out where the border is, because this is also a braided river. What's a braided river? A braided river is where water can go from here, there, creating channels. Water can flow in multiple channels, and particularly in times when it's not flooded, in drier seasons, water flows in many channels, and between the channels, because the water is also bringing a lot of silt, islands are formed. This is called a braided river, literally like a braid, like a chutia, literally like a braid. So Brahmaputra is naturally a braided river, and a hugely braided river. And that's why sometimes it becomes difficult, particularly in the plains, to figure out its width and its length in terms of where it's ending. That said, about 1,700 kilometers in China, about 1,000 in India, and about 300 then in Bangladesh. And then what happens? It comes into India, it flows through all of Assam, then goes into Bangladesh. As it goes into Bangladesh, it changes its name. In China, it's called Yarlung Tsangpo. Once it comes into India, it's called Siang. It's also called Dehang, but mostly it's called Siang. So Siang comes down, there is still some gradient available. That's why Government of India, in fact, right from the UPA era, it's an idea that precedes even the UPA era, but UPA first did the detailed project reports, allocated money, and then, as happened with many projects under the UPA, this got stopped also because of environmental concerns. And this is when Jairam Ramesh went to the northeast, held a town hall with activists and others, And after the town hall, wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, saying that these projects should not be rushed, because if they are rushed, local people may get angry and they may also get more inclined towards China. So in any case, this project didn't move. Modi government now has been trying to move it. So this project, because some gradient is still available in Siang, this is called Upper Siang hydroelectric project. This also is supposed to produce 11,000 megawatts, also a run-of-the-river project, but with a capacity of 9 billion cubic meters storage. The estimated cost would be 1,13,000 crores. Now, if you think 1,13,000 crores, 11,000 megawatts is a lot, see what the Chinese are planning. What the Chinese are planning is the world's largest hydroelectric project by far. How large? It is 3x the size of the next largest project, also built by the Chinese. That is the Three Gorges project on the Yangtze River. Now that produces 17 gigawatts of power. And when that project was planned, there were big stories in global publications, multi-page features saying what an incredible thing would be. Also, what a problematic thing it would be, because it was going to sink a lot of cities. It was going to displace 1.4 million people. In fact, it was going to sink 2 cities, 114 towns, and 1,680 villages, which it did. This project that the Chinese are now planning on the Brahmaputra, or on their side of Brahmaputra, Yarlung Tsampo, is more than 3 times the Three Gorges Dam. So this is really truly a mega project. And how will they do it? See this sketch of the Brahmaputra as it traverses Tibet, the Chinese side. As it comes out from behind the Mansarovar Massif, that is where it begins at an altitude of nearly 17,000 feet. And then as it travels down through Tibetan territory, still under Chinese control, it reaches 2,900 meters or 9,500 feet. And as it comes down, it reaches 660 meters or 2,170 feet. So from 17,400 feet within Chinese territory, it's come down to 2,170 feet. By how much altitude has this water fallen? Over this distance of nearly 1,700 kilometers. So I see a document on Assam government's website. This is Assam government's website talking about Brahmaputra Valley and Brahmaputra River. And they note that in Chinese territory, Brahmaputra River, Yarlung Tsampo, has an average gradient of 2.82 meters per kilometer, right? That's a lot of gradient for a river. However, the Chinese haven't dammed it anywhere there yet. They might do so in future. They haven't done so yet because there is gradient, but it still doesn't give you so much leverage as the river might give you later, particularly when you use fancy engineering with this. Fancy and fantasy-laden or fantastic engineering with it. In fact, once the river reaches the plains, it enters India in the Siang region. At that point, the river is at 2,170 feet or 660 meters. From there, it climbs down to the plains of Assam, where it becomes almost flat. And from there until it meets the Bay of Bengal, its gradient is only 0.1 meter per kilometer. So you cannot do very much there by way of producing power. That's the reason India is also planning its project well up there in the Siang region where a gradient is available. Now, what happens with the river as it comes into India? As the Brahmaputra comes into India, first it's joined by 2 large tributaries. And see this map also. These 2 large tributaries, one is Dibang. You can see it coming from the east. In fact, both are coming from the east, one a little bit more to the south. Dibang and Lohit. These are sizable rivers. They join the Siang River. Yarlung Tsangpo, as it comes into India, is called Siang, or sometimes Dehang, but mostly Siang. I haven't been there, but I've seen there from close, at least from air. In 1982, I had done a flight on an Indian Air Force Dakota to a place called Tooting, which used to be an advanced landing ground. It's more than an advanced landing ground now. That was during the Diamond Jubilee of the Air Force, and we had flown over this area. But then you see these 2 other big rivers joining in, and once Dibang and Lohit join in, Then it's called Brahmaputra. Then it becomes Brahmaputra. Again, a curious thing that most rivers in the Indian subcontinent are known by feminine names. They are treated as feminine. This is the only river in this subcontinent, at least from what I can see, that has a male name. So Brahmaputra, the son of Brahma, that's the name. Then what happens? Brahmaputra goes through India, nearly 1,000 kilometers, and then enters Bangladesh, again changes name. So Bangladeshis call it Jamuna. Don't confuse it with Yamuna River that is next door to our office in Delhi. No, the Bangladeshis call it Jamuna. This Jamuna then ultimately goes and joins with the Ganga. The Ganga is called Padma in Bangladesh. Once these two join, these become Meghna. If you ask a true Bengali, particularly in East Bengali, they will tell you the best hillside in the world is caught from that confluence. Now, not many tributaries join it in Bangladesh, but there is one which is significant, which I thought I must mention, and that is the Teesta River. Teesta River is where India and Bangladesh have had an old disagreement, and which the new government also in Bangladesh says. In fact, the Bangladeshi army chief was speaking the other day that India has to be more share with Bangladesh's share, as he calls it, of river waters, which essentially means the Teesta River. All of that is part of the Brahmaputra system. So why do I explain all this? Because whatever happens to Brahmaputra anywhere, India will be affected, but also Bangladesh will be affected. Now the Chinese are obviously saying that nobody will be affected. This is only a run-of-the-river project. Run-of-the-river project means we divert the river, we drop the water from the gradient, we use it to produce power, and then the water goes its own way. We have a reservoir of some size to keep the water flow consistent for our turbines, because suddenly if the river dries up, if there is a drought or snow melt stops, because on the Chinese side it's mostly a snow-fed river, then we can use the water from this reservoir. But there's not enough water to divert anywhere. In any case, from that altitude, where will that water go except downwards, which means back into the river stream. Now see this graphic. When you see this graphic, you will see something remarkable happening to the river. As the river travels east, looks like it's going straight, then it suddenly turns north. It's a sharp turn north, and then east, and then it makes a bend to the south. That is the Great Bend. And that Great Bend is between Namcha Barwa, which is a very high peak, 25,531 feet or 7,782 meters, and Gyala Peri, that is 23,930 feet or 7,294 meters. It's between these two huge peaks that this canyon is formed. Now just see what a humongous gorge this forms. This gorge, this canyon at 500 kilometers is a little bit longer than the Grand Canyon of America. It's also much deeper. In fact, in places at the highest point, so you have these 16,000 feet walls of sheer mountain on either side, and this canyon in the middle through which the river flows. In fact, one of the most adventurous kayaking expeditions or ideas in kayaking is kayaking through this gorge. Now you might ask me, you might be curious as I was, that how come such a big huge canyon got formed in this area, and then how come this gradient became so sudden that suddenly from coming such an altitude becomes a river of the plains, and what has a very high flow rate then has a very slow flow rate, so it becomes a braided river. That's because of the peculiar geology of Brahmaputra. Brahmaputra is what geologists would call antecedent of the Himalayas, which means Brahmaputra was there before the Himalayas rose. What that means is this is sitting right on top of where the Indian and the Eurasian plates meet. That's why mountains have grown around the river. The river is antecedent to the mountains. I also read that expression for the first time today, and that's also the reason that this project is going to carry particularly high seismic dangers. Now this gorge, once again, as the water is going through the gorge, the gradient is quite steep. How steep it is? If you see the gorge at 504 kilometers, this canyon is 504 kilometers, 240 kilometers is as it going up to make the bend around Namcha Barwa, and the rest about 265 kilometers as it's coming down. Now that gives it an average gradient of a little over 4 meters per kilometer. It's a lot, and yet it's not good enough to produce good quality power, which will have a very high cost. So what do the Chinese plan to do? For which, see this graphic. This graphic from the famous Nathan Ruser, whose graphics we use often. Thank you very much, Nathan. This Nathan Ruser graphic we've borrowed with gratitude from a nearly heavy paper, of which I'll share a link with you. In fact, I will share with you a link of readings as we conclude this episode. See this graphic. This graphic tells you a likely place where the Chinese may bore through the mountains. So the Chinese idea is to cut through the tall mountains, tallest mountains in Namcha Barwa. Cut through that, stop the water at 9,500 feet level. By this time, the water has already come down to 2,900 meters on 9,500 feet. Cut it there and build 20 tunnels. From those tunnels we cut across, you will see the route. Tunnels will cut across the bend. It cuts across the bend. So suddenly from 9,500 feet, the water drops to about 1,500 meters or 4,900 feet. That is a very steep gradient. Once you have water going through these tunnels at that pace, with so much gravity and so much energy coming in, and your turbines are at the other end of it, you can produce humongous amounts of power. And that is what the Chinese think will make it worth their while in terms of expense and all the engineering risks and ecological risks, etc., etc. However, nobody is convinced that it's only about energy, because for downstream countries, for lower riparians like us, what the Chinese can do it, they can use their ability to stop this water or release this water, either to create floods in our country or to deny you water in times of drought. There is always a suspicion with Chinese dam making activity, because they've done this with the Mekong system. Because of all the rivers that come out of the Tibetan plateau, Mekong is the other significant one, which India is not concerned with, but many other countries are: Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam. And all of them have suffered because the Chinese have built about 11 dams on the Mekong system. And a lot of that money is diverted. That has led to unseasonal floods and droughts in all the downstream countries. Now, India is concerned that the Chinese could divert this water. Now, it will be tough to do so because of the gradient, because the water is already come so low by the time they are producing their power. By the time the water comes to the power plant, it's already come to 2,900 meters. For it to reach any place where the Chinese have population and this water may be required, because power you can transmit easily on overhead grids. But for water, you have to deal with gravity. So if they want to take this water back to a populated area, they might end up spending more electricity just to lift this water to take there. So maybe it will not be so possible to take this water backwards into China, but definitely it will give them the power to regulate this water. Now, how dangerous is it going to be for India? First of all, it's a great irritant. It's a great irritant also because India and China do not really have a water sharing treaty. They have some basic agreements. One agreement was signed in 2002, last renewed in 2019. That was mostly about sharing data on water flow in Himalayan rivers coming in from the Tibetan side. The initial MOU on Satluj waters was signed in 2004 and revised in 2016. But after that, both sides have shown more urgency, and some cooperation has taken place until a few years ago, until these tensions arose. After the massive flooding because of the bursting of a glacial lake, formed on the Chinese side, about which India did not know. However, since the trouble in Galwan, etc. in 2020, Chinese have not been sharing this data very much, although there was a meeting held, expert level mechanism meeting held, also by video conferencing on 21st June 2023. And if you see the Chinese readout on the latest visit by our National Security Advisor to meet his Chinese counterpart, that's an ongoing special representatives meeting process. In the Chinese readout, they mentioned that the two sides discussed the need to engage on water management of shared rivers. Once again, the trust level with the Chinese is still quite low. Now, before I let you go, I just have to speak for a minute about the Brahmaputra system in India. Look at the Brahmaputra River. That's our final graphic. Look at the Brahmaputra River as it flows through India. You see it coming through Siang from Tibet. It comes in. It's not such a big river. At that point, most of the water in the river is glacial water, because that's a glacial and snow melt from the Himalayan region. So that comes in. It comes in through the watershed, through the gorge, through the valley. Then these two Indian big tributaries join it, Lohit and Dibang. It becomes a much bigger river. This is where that first, the most easternmost Brahmaputra bridge has been built. It's not really on Brahmaputra, it's on Lohit River. That is the Dola Sadia bridge, or the bridge that's named after Bhupen Hazarika. That goes over the Lohit River. Now, as the river enters the plains, and you can see its expanse, doesn't have that much depth to go, and it has a very slow flow because the gradient is so little. That's the reason it spreads out, and that's the reason it becomes braided as it goes along. However, India is not dependent mostly on water that comes from the Chinese side, because very little water into the Brahmaputra system comes from over the watershed, from the Chinese side. The Siang does, that is Yarlung Tsangpo does, but most of the other tributaries, Brahmaputra has 33 tributaries in India, 20 on the northern side, 13 on its southern sides. Most of those come out of the Patkai hills, and all of the ones on the northern side come from the Himalayas. They are mostly from the Himalayan snow melt and also from monsoon water, because this area, this part of India gets very heavy monsoons, beginning in fact sometime towards the end of April. So these rivers are going to have a lot of water, generally speaking. So there is no need for us to get paranoid and to start losing sleep. However, what the Chinese are doing, one, is provocative. Second, because of the low level of trust that China enjoys among its neighbors, there is always concern about what the Chinese would do. And third, this is now going to give India a sense of urgency in doing something with the water that's coming into its own territory, particularly say with Siang River or the Brahmaputra as it's called as it enters India, because that's where gradient is available. There are similar projects planned on Dibang, on Kameng River. Kameng is one of the major tributaries, sort of more on the western side of Arunachal Pradesh, washing into the Brahmaputra. So those projects, I suspect, will get a sense of urgency. And since I promised you a bunch of readings, there we go. You will see screenshots on your screen, but also links with the description. Neely Hebe, a paper by Neely Hebe for Australian Strategic Policy Institute, The Geopolitics of Water, How the Brahmaputra River Could Shape India-China Security Competition. Second, from Economic and Political Weekly, it's an older article, but very wise, very astute, by Ramaswamy Iyer. That's India-China Brahmaputra, Suggestions for an Approach. Then there's a 2013 article from National Bureau of Asian Research, China's Upstream Advantage in the Great Himalayan Watershed, by Jennifer Turner, Susan Chan Shiflett, and Robert Batten, and from Center for Economic Policy Research. Next, China's new super dam carries both geopolitical and environmental risks, by the familiar Brahmachalani, our strategic scholar. This is on thehill.com, so please check it out. And the final link I'm sharing with you is from the Assam government website, which has excellent detail on the Brahmaputra River system, its tributaries, their names, where they come from, and also some water flow data, etc.